Hi guys, and welcome to a virtual flight training. My name is Roel, and today we're going to take a look at Jeppesen plates. This video is part 1 of a series on how to read and use the charts pilots use for different procedures. This means we're going to look at precision approaches, non-precision approaches, standard instrument departures or SIDs, standard terminal arrival or STARs, and aerodrome plates. We'll start off today with the precision approaches and see how to approach these precisely. First of all, let's talk about the differences between a precision and non-precision approach. The main difference is that a precision approach has a vertical guidance provided by a ground-based system. For example, the glide slope antenna of an instrument landing system, the ILS. Although RNAV, which stands for area navigation, approaches are becoming more and more precise and are already replacing conventional NDB and VOR non-precision approaches. They don't use ground-based systems for vertical guidance, but instead they use a combination of a GPS location and/or barometric reference, depending on the type of approach. So although an RNAV approach is quite precise, we still consider it a non-precision approach. But I'll get to that in a different video. Contrary to non-precision approaches, precision approaches come in one flavor about 99% of the time, and that is the Instrument Landing System, or ILS. So today I'll focus on this one, but I'd like to mention that there are others, like the Microwave Landing System, or MLS, and the new GBAS Landing System, or GLS. GBAS stands for Ground-Based Augmentation System, so the full name is Ground-Based Augmentation System Landing System, which is a ridiculous abbreviation even for aviation standards. MLS was supposed to be the replacement for ILS, but it never made it into widespread use, despite it being superior to ILS. The technology is expensive and it needs a separate antenna for every runway like an ILS, so there are no major advantages over an ILS system. With the arrival of accurate GPS-based systems, it became clear that the future for MLS wasn't bright. GLS, on the other hand, uses only one antenna per airport. It's in addition to the GPS that provides integrity verifications, which is a complicated story, but it basically means that it makes your GPS a lot more accurate. So accurate, in fact, that it removes the need for other ground-based systems like the ILS. But this system is still very new and not widespread yet. So for now, ILS it is. Before we start looking at the chart, I want to mention that all turns during an instrument approach are rate 1 turns. A rate 1 turn is a turn of 3 degrees per second, so a 180 degree turn takes 1 minute and a 360 takes 2 minutes. The amount of bank necessary to achieve a rate 1 turn can be calculated by using the formula true airspeed divided by 10 plus 7. Luckily, the G1000 has a nice trick up its sleeve to make life a lot easier. Of course, this is something that I'll show you when flying this procedure in the sim. I think that's enough background information for now. So let's start with the main topic of this video, the ILS chart. Here we see an ILS plate for runway 35 center in Graz, Austria. There is a lot of information on here and it's quite cluttered, so don't worry if it looks a bit overwhelming. We are going to filter the info on this plate and extract what we need, one step at a time. Jeppesen plates are designed with a reading flow in mind. This flow isn't exactly what you'd expect, because we start to read from the top right and read to the left. We start at the top section of the chart, called the briefing section. In the top right is mentioned which procedure we're looking at and where it is located. This is the chart for the ILS localizer approach for runway 35 center in Graz, Austria. These particular charts are for approaches up to ILS Category 1. Category 2 and Category 3 have their own plates, but the only section in which they are different from these is the different minimums. So if you understand this plate, you will understand the Cat 2 and Cat 3 plates. The chart number and the effective dates are placed in the top center. The chart number is very important in the approach briefing because it validates that two pilots are looking at the same plate. We are looking at plate 11-1. Also mentioned here is a revision date in black text and the effective date in white text. This tells us when the chart was issued and how up to date it is. From here we're going to read normally left to right. In the first row we can see all the radio frequencies that we will need for this approach, so we can prepare the radios beforehand. In the next row we'll find navigation information, starting with the frequency for the localizer. We turn the nav radio to this frequency to obtain the guidance for the final approach. Next is the final approach course, in this case 346 degrees. To the right is the altitude and height above the final approach fix, or FAF. At this point the final approach segment starts, which ends at the missed approach point. In this segment the final descent and runway alignment are made. To the right is where normally the minimum descent altitude and height are listed, but in this case there are too many variables, so they are listed at the bottom part of the chart. But we'll get to that later. Continuing on this row, and we see the airport and runway elevation. The runway elevation listed here is the elevation of the threshold of the runway that we are using. The last box in this row is the minimum sector altitude, or MSA. The MSA is the lowest altitude we can fly at without risking collisions with the terrain or buildings or any other obstacles, within a 25 nautical mile radius of a designated point. In this case, that point is the Golf Romeo Zulu VOR. In other cases, it will be ARP, or the Airport Reference Point. This is a designated point on the airport itself from where the MSA is applicable. The next row tells us everything about the missed approach sequence. It tells us to climb straight, which means runway heading, so at 346 degrees. When at a DME distance of 3 nautical miles from Oscar Echo Golf, a right turn has to be made towards the Golf Bravo Golf NDB while climbing to 5,000 feet. After that, we enter a hold over the NDB to wait further instructions. The row below this section contains some small information regarding the altimeter settings, and in this case it should be set to use hectopascals. This is important for transcontinental flights from North America that might use inches of mercury normally. The barometric equivalent of the elevation is mentioned here. Also the transition level and transition altitude can be found in this row. In this case the transition level is variable, so Air Traffic Control or ATIS will provide this information. The transition altitude is 10,000 feet at this airport. Okay, so that was the briefing strip. With that out of the way, we can move on to the plan view section of the chart. The plan view will give us the horizontal profile of this approach. Here we see a lot of triangles, lines, numbers, symbols and weird names. I'm not going to explain and show every symbol that can possibly exist on these type of charts, so if you are interested you can check the full glossary by clicking the link in the description. I'll cover the general stuff here that you'll be using the most, and we'll start with decluttering this chart to make it easier to understand what we're looking at. What we see now are the routes that have to be flown in order to fly this approach. Let's start with identifying what is shown here. So this is the runway we're going to approach. This thick-lined gear wheel indicates that there is a DME present on the airport. This DME is associated with localizer Oscar Echo Golf. The details for Oscar Echo Golf can be found to the left in the rounded box. Here we find the final approach course, the nav frequency identifier and Morse identifier displayed. The Morse code can be used to verify that the correct frequency has been put into the navigation radio by listening to it. Modern avionics will use this code to display the identifier on a screen, so the pilot doesn't need to listen to the Morse codes anymore. This arrow is the localizer beam, which provides horizontal guidance to line the aircraft up with the runway. This here is the Golf Romeo Zulu VOR, but we will call it by its name, Grass VOR. Like with the localizer, the frequency and Morse code are listed as well. The same applies to the Grass NDB and Gleichenberg NDB. This little d means that there is a DME associated with this VOR. Note that the Gleichenberg NDB is shown twice. This one is showing the published holding pattern in case of a missed approach. It's stated that when entering the holding pattern, the NDB must be overflown. The other one is here and serves as a starting point for a new approach. Looking at the Grass VOR, we can see two racetracks. The outer one will set us up for the approach and the inner one is the published holding pattern. It's stated here that the MHA is 4,000 feet. MHA stands for minimum holding altitude, so when flying this holding pattern, your altitude must be at least 4,000 feet. This ensures proper separation from obstacles and aircraft that might have to go around, since the holding is directly above the final approach. On this chart, 4 ways of flying this approach are covered. 2 of them start at the grass VOR, one at the Gleichenberg NDB, and the other one is coming from the west. Today we'll mainly focus on the routes via the grass VOR, as they are the easiest and most straightforward. The first one will start above the grass VOR and follows the racetrack. The directions of the holding pattern are the same as for the racetrack approach, so when approach is commenced after a holding over the grass VOR, this will be the approach that's going to be used. It starts by making a 180-degree turn to the right on a heading of 166 degrees to the first waypoint. This waypoint is located at 7 nautical miles DME from the grass VOR. Upon reaching this waypoint, another 180-degree turn is made towards a heading of 346 degrees. When coming out of the turn, the localizer should be alive and the alignment procedure can begin. From here, it's just a matter of following the localizer and glide slope towards the runway. The second one also starts overhead the grass VOR, but instead of making a 180-degree turn, it immediately goes on a heading of 146 degrees to the first waypoint. From here, it's identical to the first procedure. The third one starts at the Gleichenberg NDB, with the fourth one being a mirrored version. These approaches are a bit unique because it involves flying a DME arc. A DME arc is a procedure where you keep a constant distance from a DME, in this case 12 nautical miles. This is a procedure that's not overly common and is perceived to be difficult maneuver to do. This, however, is not the case, and I will go into more detail about DME arcs in a future video. So let's forget these approaches for now. The small triangles are non-compulsory fixes. This means they are specified points in space on which the whole approach is based on. Non-compulsory means that ATC doesn't have to be notified when one of these fixes is overflown. If it is a compulsory fix, ATC has to be notified when crossing them. At some approaches, the fixes are often named after the primary navigation aid used in that approach, for easier identification, but that's usually reserved for larger airports. Other points have 5-letter names and are used for multiple procedures or are waypoints unspecific to a certain procedure. In this example, we have Vagil, which is not a fix like the rest, but rather the initial approach fix, or IAF. This is the point where the approach officially starts. North of the airport, you can see the visualization of the missed approach procedure. This visualizes what we read in the missed approach part of the briefing strip a bit earlier. Okay, so now we have an idea of what we can expect. Now let's add some clutter with additional information. On the left side of the plan view, there are 2 boxes with additional information. The top left has a list of recommended altitudes in case the glide slope is inoperative. When this happens, this procedure loses its vertical guidance and will therefore be a non-precision approach. This is called the localizer approach or LOC approach. Instead of following the glide slope beam, descending has to be done manually. And these numbers are checks to see if the descent path of the aircraft is how it should be. On the left, you have the distances from the Oscar Echo Golf DME, and to the right the altitudes you should be at when at that distance. So at 5 nautical miles, the aircraft should be at 2,700 feet. We'll get back to this a bit later. And the other small box states that DME equipment on board of the aircraft is required to fly this approach. Below we see another waypoint. It's stated that it's located at 15 nautical miles from the grass VOR on the 236 radial. In the top right corner, it states that the information provided here is only applicable to Austria. Time to add more clutter. This is information regarding the waypoints. By now you should understand what the info means. It's really just distances from a particular nav aid. Vagil, on the other hand, has some other information next to it. It will become clear when we move on to the profile view of this chart, which we'll do shortly. The last pieces of information in the plan view are the obstacles present in the airport's vicinity, with the fat arrows pointing towards the highest obstacle on this chart. The obstacle symbols represent a certain type of obstacles, like chimneys, churches, radio towers, etc. etc. Grass is located at the foot of the Austrian Alps, so mountains are the highest obstacle here. That was the plan view section of this chart, and by now we have a pretty good idea of what this approach is all about. But to execute it perfectly, we need to take a good look at the profile view as well. This is the profile view, and it shows the vertical information of this approach. For obvious reasons, we start at the top of our descent path. Like I mentioned before, our approach starts overhead the grass VOR. When we follow the line towards the first waypoint at 7 nautical miles DME, we see two headings listed. Those correspond with the red and blue lines we saw on the plan view. It stated that we should be at 3,300 feet when at 7 DME. We stay on this altitude until we hit the glide slope, which is at 6.8 nautical miles DME and is marked by this symbol. From here, we follow the glide slope to the runway. Again, a lot of distances are listed here, but those are more of a reference so you can cross-check to make sure everything is as it should. When the approach is made via Vagil, the descent starts at 3,500 feet at 7.4 nautical miles DME, instead of what is shown here. It's not a big difference and you will end up on the same glide slope, but you should be aware of it when flying this approach via Vagil. Now let's move on to the conversion table and icons, which is the next row on this chart. We start at the ground speed to descent angle table. To maintain a descent angle of 3 degrees, we must know what our final approach speed is applicable to our aircraft. In case of a 90 knots final approach speed, we need a descent rate of 372 feet per minute, and for 140 knots is 743 feet per minute. Of course, you can interpolate if the final approach speed you need isn't listed here. This is where the table we saw in the plan view comes into play. In case the glide slope is inoperative, a descent has to be done manually. If we descend using the descent rate listed or calculated here, the altitude should match up with the distances we saw in the table earlier. Also listed here is the different missed approach point for the localizer approach. Further right is the icon that tells us what lighting system is present on this runway, with a little diagram of how it looks like. This runway is equipped with an ALSF2 lighting system, which stands for Approach Lighting System with Sequence Flashing Lights Configuration 2, and looks like this. Runway end identification lights are also present, as well as PAPI lights. The placement of the word PAPI means at which sides of the runway they are situated, so in this case they are located on the left. The next icon is another brief summary of the initial procedure for the go-around. And finally, at the bottom of the charts, the minimums are listed. At some airports where circling to land is allowed, this is also where you'll find the minimums for that approach, like we see to the right. Some airports have a special chart for circle to land procedure and would be mentioned in this box as well. A circle to land allows the use of an approach down to minimum descent altitude and fly a visual part to land on the opposite runway. This also deserves its own video, as there is quite bit more to it. Here we see multiple decision altitudes listed, with the decision height in brackets. As you can see, the different altitudes correspond with the aircraft categories. These categories refer to the maneuvering speed of aircraft, as you can see here. So you choose the decision altitude based on that. At the decision altitude, you must have visual contact with the runway. If there is no visual contact, going around is the only thing to do. RVR, or runway visual range, is listed below. The minimum RVR is 550 meters for all categories of aircraft, but this is only true if all runway and approach lighting systems are operational. If the touchdown zone, TDZ, and/or the center lights, CL, are out, the RVR increases to 750 meters. But if the airplane you're flying is using a flight director, autopilot, or heads-up display to fly towards the decision altitude, The minimum RVR required stays at 550 meters. If the approach lighting system is not operational, the RVR increases to 1200 meters regardless of aircraft systems. That's for the ILS, but since this chart also has the localizer procedure on it, the minimums for that are listed here as well. And that's about it for precision approaches. We'll discuss non-precision approaches in a future video. Although there are more similarities than differences in the way the charts work, I decided it deserves its own video. Also because there are several types of non-precision approaches in widespread use today. Quite opposite to the precision approaches, which are ILS approaches 99% of the time. Now that you know how to fly an ILS, it's time to practice it. In the next video, I'll show you how to brief this ILS and fly it in the sim, so stay tuned for that. And that's it for now. I hope you learned something and enjoyed that process. Thank you for watching and I hope to see you next time.